Now, I want to turn to today's budget presentation. As I share our preliminary budget for the upcoming fiscal year, I want to be clear about the moment we are in and the two paths that lie before us. As the mayor of New York City, I have a legal obligation to balance the budget. I will meet that obligation. This administration will govern with the seriousness, responsibility, and accountability that has too long been absent from City Hall. When we took office, we inherited a historic budget gap. Our aggressive savings plan, daily incorporation of updated revenue and bonus estimates, and our deployment of in-year reserves, in tandem with more than $1 billion in additional aid from Governor Hochul, have lowered that deficit from an initial $12 billion to $5.4 billion. While considerably less, it is still a significant chasm. I know that for those who have watched budget after budget, it is tempting to assume that we are engaging in the same dance as our predecessors. Let me assure you, nothing about this is typical. That's why our solutions won't be either. There are two paths to bridge this gap. The first is the most sustainable and the fairest path. This is the path of ending the drain on our city and raising taxes on the richest New Yorkers and the most profitable corporations. The onus for resolving this crisis should not be placed on the backs of working and middle-class New Yorkers. If we do not fix this structural imbalance and do not heed the calls of New Yorkers to raise taxes on the wealthy, this crisis will not disappear. It will simply return, year after year, forcing harder and harsher choices each time. And if we do not go down the first path, the city will be forced down a second, more harmful path. Faced with no other choice, the city would have to exercise the only revenue lever fully within our own control. We would have to raise property taxes. We would also be forced to raid our reserves. To balance the budget as required by law, our preliminary budget takes the only path within our control, the second path. The options of the second path are the options of last resort, options that we will only employ if there is no other means of arriving at a balanced budget. We will spend the coming months doing everything in our power to ensure that our final budget reflects the first path. We remain firmly within a budget crisis. It is a crisis that we can and will overcome. But we cannot do so without either significant structural changes in Albany or painful decisions of last resort here at home. I am encouraged and heartened by the relationship that we have built with Governor Hochul and the state legislature, and hopeful that we can arrive at a fair solution at the end of this budget process. Now, let's walk through what we inherited, what we have done so far, and what lies ahead. We begin with the budget crisis we inherited. This crisis did not materialize overnight. It originated with Mayor Adams' 2025 November plan. The city's budget at the time was $118.2 billion. That plan projected a $4.7 billion gap in fiscal year 2027 and a $6.3 billion gap over fiscal years 2028 and 2029. We now know that those gaps were significantly understated. To understand the magnitude of what we inherited, the deficit left to us was larger than the gaps left by both Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor de Blasio to their successors. And that's even before accounting for enormous under-budgeted needs by the prior administration. Adams' November plan left the city with a $12 billion budget gap. When we took office, our team scrutinized every facet of city spending. What we found was in line with what former City Controller Lander found on December 16th, what State Controller DiNapoli found on December 22nd, and what City Controller Levine affirmed on January 16th. The $12 billion budget deficit confronting our city was historically vast. After incorporating $4 billion in revenue above what the November plan had assessed, and after taking standard budget actions, our administration found that our city's deficit was in line with the controller's projections. Today, as we lay out our preliminary budget, every decision we have made has been informed by this context and the challenges we inherited. This was a historic deficit, larger even than those faced during the Great Recession. Much of this gap came in the form of significant under-budgeting for major expenses. The prior administration ignored projections that estimated costs would rise. Across 6 foundational city services, like cash assistance, rental assistance, and shelter costs, more than $7.5 billion were left unaccounted for. The consequence was an enormous deficit within our budget. Beyond those 6 areas, there are additional major unfunded needs. The city must fulfill more than $6.6 billion in additional unfunded needs and state mandates, the most sizable of which are detailed on the screen. While we had no say over the budget crisis we inherited, we have taken a number of steps to address expenses and are monitoring our revenues daily to tackle the gap. In January, in this very room, I promised we would continue to incorporate up-to-date Wall Street revenues into our budget. That is exactly what we have done. Part of our ability to shrink the gap has come from incorporating higher than expected revenues from Wall Street. Wall Street profits are at a record high, surpassing any projections and allowing us to incorporate more revenue than anyone anticipated. Those record profits translate into increased tax revenue, $2.4 billion more than anticipated in fiscal year 2026, and $4.9 billion more than anticipated in fiscal year 2027. That's on top of revenue already added in the November plan. We are being as aggressive as we can in recognizing additional revenue and have surpassed the state in our estimates of personal income tax, corporate tax, and sales tax. But responsible governance is not only about revenue. It is also about discipline. That means finding savings across city government, reducing bureaucratic waste, and rendering agencies more efficient and cost-effective. That is why I signed an executive order establishing a chief savings officer in every city agency. Chief savings officers, or CSOs, have a simple remit: identifying savings within the agencies they serve. They will consolidate redundancies, insource programs that have been outsourced to bloated consultant contracts, and eliminate extraneous programs. Each CSO will issue a public report by March 20th, detailing the savings they have found and provide updated assessments every 6 months. These CSOs will have clear goals: 1.5% in savings in fiscal year 2026 and 2.5% in fiscal year 2027. Our work to find savings, however, is not limited to CSOs. We are pursuing a number of other avenues as well. We are significantly reducing current vacancies and removing hiring constraints to promote effective agency operations. We are hiring 50 new auditors at the Department of Finance, which we expect will generate $100 million in new revenue per year. We are also adding 200 lawyers to the law department to reduce tort liability, which we anticipate will yield $125 million in savings in fiscal year 2027 alone. We are not just looking for savings and efficiencies in the short term. We are also going after long-term causes of cost growth. Taken together, these aggressive savings measures, maximal use of in-year reserves, and daily recognition of updated revenues have allowed us to reduce the budget gap from $12 billion to $7 billion. I want to commend the members of my team who have exhausted every option to improve our fiscal outlook. I also want to thank Governor Hochul for her partnership. Yesterday, she announced that Albany would contribute $1.5 billion in state aid to help us bridge this gap. As the governor aptly said, a strong New York City means a stronger New York State. I'm grateful to the governor for her support throughout the budget crisis. Here is what the state's $1.5 billion contribution includes: $150 million per year, reversing the distressed hospital sales tax intercept; $60 million per year, reversing of a public health cost shift; $300 million per year invested in youth programming; and $500 million in one-time unrestricted state aid. Much of this state assistance reverses long-standing Cuomo-era cost shifts. And we've also just received information that new data in the state's school aid formula will bring an additional $97 million to New York City on a recurring basis. All of that brings the fiscal deficit down to $5.4 billion. But I want to be clear, $5.4 billion is still a very steep mountain to climb. And there are 2 paths that we can walk: one that offers long-term stability, and a second one with significant pain that we deeply hope to avoid. The first path repairs the structural imbalance between the city and the state. We want to work with Albany to raise personal income taxes by 2% on the 33,000 New Yorkers earning more than $1 million a year, and to raise corporate taxes on the most profitable corporations. And we know that for far too long, New Yorkers have given far more to the state than what we have received in return. It is time to end the drain. If we cannot follow this first path, we will be forced onto a much more damaging path of last resort, one where we have to use the only tools at the city's disposal, raising property taxes and raiding our reserves. This second path is painful. We will continue to work with Albany to avoid it. This first path will deliver the structural change that we need to recalibrate the relationship between the city and the state. Because as we know, New Yorkers contribute 54.5% of state revenue, but receive only 40.5% back. At the same time, New York City's portion of the state's GDP has grown by nearly 10% since 2010. That imbalance is untenable. Once again, I'm calling for Albany to end the drain. There is no third option of failing to balance the budget. By law, ever since the fiscal crisis of the 1970s, which placed the city on the brink of bankruptcy, New York City has been legally required to balance its budget. We will do so. If we cannot pursue the first path, the only option we have remaining is the second path. At the heart of this path is a property tax increase. This would effectively be a tax on working and middle-class New Yorkers who have a median income of $122,000. The second path also requires us to raid our reserves. It would mean withdrawing $980 million from our city's rainy day fund in fiscal year 2026 and $229 million from the Retiree Health Benefit Trust in fiscal year 2027. These are steps that have been taken before, but only in moments of extraordinary external crisis. Mayor Bloomberg's response to the 2008 financial collapse and Mayor de Blasio's response to the enormous revenue shortfall caused by the pandemic. We do not want to have to turn to such drastic measures to balance our budget. Now, let's talk about what this means for our future. Let me share the details of our preliminary budget for the upcoming fiscal year, the needs that we're meeting, and the investments we're making in New Yorkers. This is a budget that is balanced at $122 billion in fiscal year 2026 and $127 billion in fiscal year 2027. You can see here the breakdowns in spending by percentage of agency budgets. 40% of funding that goes to agencies is going to DOE, 26% is going to social services, 12% to our uniformed agencies, and the remaining 22% to the many other agencies that keep our city running. This reflects our priorities: education, healthcare, safety, and the everyday functioning of the city that we love. This preliminary budget increases city expenses by over $14 billion, expenses that we have to fund because the Adams administration failed to. This includes $7.5 billion for the 6 under-budgeted areas I mentioned earlier, including cash and rental assistance and shelter costs, and $5.85 billion to fund additional needs that were previously left unbudgeted. As you can see here, of our city dollars in this plan, only 4% represents new programmatic spending. Again, of $14 billion, only $576 million is going to deliver new programmatic spending. Some of that spending includes immediate protections for New Yorkers in this winter. $5 million helped us open warming centers and street outreach increases for homeless New Yorkers during the recent snowstorm. This also includes an addition of $100 million to our snow removal budget. Beyond winter response, we are expanding services to our most vulnerable neighbors. We are increasing clinical and behavioral health services to New Yorkers living with severe mental illness and deepening our efforts to connect homeless New Yorkers with shelter and healthcare. And as we look to protect New York's fiscal health, we will also protect New Yorkers' rights. We are bringing on 200 attorneys and 100 support staff within the law department. And we are more than tripling baseline funding for HRA's Community Food Connection Emergency Food Program, adding $54 million in fiscal year 2027 and onwards so that we meet the needs of New Yorkers in crisis. Let's close with the long-term investments that we are making in our capital plan to deliver a healthy, vibrant, safe city for New Yorkers. We are showing you here the city's $113 billion preliminary 5-year capital plan. Those investments span transportation, environmental protection, housing, schools, and other core priorities, the physical foundation of a thriving city. This capital plan also makes major investments in NYCHA developments, including $662 million in fiscal year 2027 to boost renovations, and over $38 million specifically to install heat pumps in more than 700 housing units in the Rockaways. We will also invest over $48 million in the expansion of the Adult Comprehensive Psychiatric Emergency Program at Bellevue Hospital. This is a critical need that will make an enormous difference in the lives of 2,500 additional New Yorkers each year. To conclude, here is our preliminary budget as it stands. It reflects the second path that the city is forced to go down, because today it is the only path fully within our control. But let me repeat what I have said many times this morning. This is the preliminary budget. We will do everything in our power to budget reflects the first path, a path that ends the drain and asks the wealthiest among us and the most profitable corporations to contribute that little bit more so that working New Yorkers do not bear the burden of this financial crisis. Now I will go through our financial plan. As you can see here at the top, this is the November 2025 financial plan released by the Adams administration that projected a balance of fiscal year 2026 and then the out-year gaps of more than $6 billion with a gap of $4.6 billion in the fiscal year 2027. Here we see tax revenues, $2.4 billion, $4.1 billion fiscal year 2027, and then we have the out years. We can see here of the state action, the fiscal impact of the decoupling from federal legislation will yield $723 million in additional revenue starting in the next fiscal year. Here is part of the $1.5 billion that I was referring to earlier from the state. This is the sales tax distressed hospital intercept. Here is the impact from state tax programs that we support, but also have a fiscal impact on the city, taking $3 million in revenue this year, $64 million the next year. This is the one-time unrestricted state aid that I was referring to earlier, $500 million. Here are the non-tax revenues. These are effectively fines, fees that are collected by the city, $56 million this year, $25 million the next year. This reflects the second path that we are forced to take within this preliminary budget, which showcases an increase in property taxes yielding $3.7 billion in the next fiscal year. All of that leaves us with the total revenue changes of more than $3 billion in fiscal year 26, more than $8.6 billion in fiscal year 2027. Then if we go into the expense changes, we see by finally acknowledging the under-budgeted agency needs, we see a $6.6 billion change in this fiscal year, $7.4 billion in fiscal year 2027. This is a cost that the city has paid in recent years, but not reflected on its budget. We are bringing that to be clear with New Yorkers as to the money that we are spending as the city, $911 million in fiscal year 26 for the Health Stabilization Fund, $1.144 billion in the next fiscal year. These are the savings that we anticipate from the NYCE PPO health savings, $411 million this year, $791 million next year through the renegotiation of city healthcare plans. Then here is part of the 1.5 that I was referring to earlier. This is the reversal of Article 6, the provision of youth programming and school aid. $360 million in fiscal year 2026, increases to $457 in the next fiscal year because of the addition of the $97 million in additional school aid. These are the costs of pension. We have $16 million this year, savings of $99 next year. Then we have debt service savings of $40 million this year, spending of $40 million the next year. Then we have the general reserve, 1.150 in fiscal year 2026, 1.1 billion in fiscal year 2027, leaving the required amount within that reserve. This is the rating of the reserves that I was referring to earlier that we are forced to do in the second path. That's $229 million from the Retiree Health Benefits Trust Reserve. However, I will also show that in fiscal year 2028, we then return that funding back into both the Retiree Health Benefits Trust Reserve as well as the Rainy Day Fund, because we are seeking to put our city on firm financial footing. Rainy Day Fund, a withdrawal of $980 million in fiscal year 2026. Then we see the Capital Stabilization Fund, $250 million in both fiscal years. Labor reserve savings, $150 million here, $400 million in the next. These are the savings I was speaking about of 1.5% in this fiscal year, 2.5% in the next projected agency savings with the CSOs. This is an adjustment for OTPS inflation of $56 million in 2027 fiscal year. This is a re-estimate of prior year expenses and receivables. All of that leaves us with expense changes of nearing $3 billion in fiscal year 2026, more than $4 billion in 2027, and then we go into the out years. Then, as you can see, as a result of these approaches, it is a balanced budget in fiscal year 2026, a balanced budget in fiscal year 2027 as required by law, and then out year gaps here from 28 to 30. And I'll just go through the next slide as well. This is an overview of the amount of money that we are receiving in the subtotal of taxes. You can see existing property tax, other taxes, tax audit revenue, tax programs, and then the increase in property taxes if the city is forced to do so. You then see the subtotal of city funds, where in addition to those taxes, we are adding in miscellaneous revenues, unrestricted intergovernmental aid, things of that nature, brings us to $91 billion in fiscal year 26, $97.6 billion fiscal year 27, and then that brings us out with the addition of categorical grants to $122 billion for fiscal year 26, $127 billion in fiscal year 27. Then if we look at expenditures, we're seeing personal service. We're seeing that come out to about $61.4 billion in fiscal year 26, $62.9 fiscal year 27. And then other than personal service, we see the subtotal of about $59.2 billion this fiscal year, $56.5 in the next fiscal year. All of those things added together with addition to the reserves as well, we find the total expenditures of $122.3 billion for this fiscal year, $127 billion for the next fiscal year. The gap to be closed in 26 is 0, in 27 is 0 as required by law, and then the gaps in the out years.